Hello, everyone, and welcome to the episode of IGNIT's knowledge series entitled What is Spot Entries? I'm Ursula, and I'm a member of the IGNIT teams. Before we go on into our main topic today, allow me to give a brief introduction about IGNIT and why I have launched this series online. IGNIT is an international network of event professionals who wants to make a difference in the world. We provide specialized consultant services in combination with active and integrated support project delivery. We are also strong advocates of education, and it's one of IGNIT's main pillars. With the scope of education in mind, we believe that knowledge share is vital to continue innovation and improvement of policies and processes in the sports industry. So we have launched this series called the What Is series to provide some specific knowledge and information where we dive into the who, what, why, when, how, and why questions around a specific topic like media operations, transportation, hospitality services. Each episode has a specialist from IGNIT families or within a network of experts. They are very passionate about what they do and have practical experience in the focus areas. And today I have very two good friends of mine, Lin Dan and Andres Santi, who I worked with in Buenos Aires 2018 Youth Olympic Games. Andres started his career in tourist sales and data analysis at Apple, but discovered his true passion while volunteering in several sports events. For the past 3 years, he's been in organizing committees for summer and winter Youth Olympic Games, Winter European Youth Olympic Festival, mainly work with Accreditation and Sport Entries team. Currently, he's joined the Association of National Olympic Committees to assist and plan future development to the future editions of ANOC Beach Games. Neo is one of the four co-founders of IGNIT and is one of the few Malaysians who works in the international scene of multi-sport events for the past year. She specialized in sports entrance and qualification, registration and accreditation operations, and games management system. She kicked off her career immediately after completing the AISTS in 2009. She joined the Singapore Youth Olympic Games for 2010, and since then she has been part of Winter Olympic Games, Summer and Winter Youth Olympic Games, Summer University, European Youth Olympic Festival, ANOC World Beach Series, among other events in the past decade. She's also a current consultant for International Olympic Committee Sports Department. So without further ado, let's bring them in. Hello, Neo.
Hi, Ursu. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm very good.
What time is it in Malaysia?
It's just past 9.
Just past 9, and I believe it's not too hot, right?
Well, I have a fan heading towards me now, so you can see like a little breeze on my hair.
That's good. Let's bring Andres in.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Ursula. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm very well. I just realized we're sitting on 3 different continents, which, I don't know, sounds kind of amazing.
Yes.
How is things in Switzerland?
All pretty well. Not too hot today, so we're quite lucky.
That's good. So let's get started. I know our friends are anxious about it, so I'll give the floor to you.
All right. Thank you, Ursula. Hi, Andres.
Hi. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. I'm looking forward to presenting this with you. So let's get started. So what is spot entries? And what do you think is important about spot entries? So as you can see here on the screen, it says the official entry of athletes into the games. But what exactly does that mean? Why does an organizing committee of a sport event even need spot entries? And some of you may ask, what is the difference between official entry of athletes and the registration of athletes? Now, there are 2 main reasons why we need spot entries in events. Number 1, without spot entries, an organizing committee will not be able to do proper planning. And number 2, without spot entries, the actual athletes that will participate into an event cannot be identified. So as we go along this presentation, you will come to understand what I just said about proper planning and actual athletes. Now, I'm sure all of you know that numbers are essential in a planning phase of an event. You need to know the number of accredited participants, you need to know the number of buses that you need to be used, and you need to know the number of tickets that need to be printed. Every planning starts with numbers, which, as you know, impact the most important element that numbers make up, the budget. So where does the basis of these planning numbers come from? The answer is the number of athletes. And who is the keeper of this number of athletes? Us, of course, sport entries. So a big portion of our job is playing with athlete numbers because we estimate, we track, we monitor all the athletes around the world. The athlete numbers then are used in a special formula, which is a policy defined by the event owner that calculates nearly everything that is related to the delegation, like the number of team officials, the number of guests, the number of vehicle passes. So the athlete numbers are basically the root of the calculation. So that's why you can see there's a tree here. So once you know the root, then you can determine the bark, which to me is the total delegation. And then from the bark, you get the branches and the leaves. Am I right? So in sport entries, as I mentioned earlier, we do all the estimating, the tracking, the monitoring, whatever you can think of with athlete numbers, we do. And of course, we also do a lot of calculation, and we use a tool called the MATS, which is literally translated to maximum estimated team size, which is developed for each games before we start the planning phase. Now, the MATS tool actually is 10 years old, and this is the 10th anniversary as it started in Singapore 2010. The MATS is then constantly updated to ensure that it houses reliable data at that point of time. What I mean with reliable data is that actually the MATS evolves from having historical data from previous games to delegations estimation to the qualification of athletes, and finally, the actual size of every delegation. And all the time, these numbers are shared with functional areas through our friends in delegation services.
So as Neo well mentioned, the maximum estimated team size file is the source of information for many functional areas within the organization. So let's look at some couple of examples we have come up with. One of the functional areas that constantly requests an updated version of this file is village management. I mean, for village management or village allotment, the MATS file has become an essential tool of planning to know, I mean, first of all, to see the sizes of each delegation from our estimation to do their planning and allotment in the village. Because did you think that allotment happens just 5 days before of the games? I mean, it's quite difficult to do that, since allotting or finding a bed in the village for each delegation is like a big puzzle, like the allotment team likes to call it, where they need to put every piece carefully together. And for that, advanced and careful planning is needed. So by knowing more or less how big a delegation will be, like, for example, 1 year before the game, gives them enough time to make these plannings. And then the more qualification events that happen, a few changes might happen. We might modify the file a little bit, but then they will apply the, as I call it, the react and adapt approach, which is just adapting those pieces to complete this big puzzle. Another functional area, or, well, for example, in events, where the event owner or the event organizer buys the flights for almost all the delegates, this tool has also become essential. So this impacts the arrivals and departures functional area and the official travel agent. because similar to the allotment, flights are not booked just before the games. And you would imagine that booking for all the athletes going to the other side of the world would be quite challenging, expensive, and probably there will not be enough seats available last minute for all these athletes. So the official travel agency booking the flights would take this file where he sees the estimates and the sizes per delegation that we are estimating, and would pre-book and already buy seats and routes. And then they would apply the same approach, like the react and adapt when changes occur, because it's easier and for sure cheaper to cancel one seat if there is a change, or add 2 seats or 3 seats to a plane. So basically, these are one of the 2 big examples which also have a quite impact on budget. But examples like this we can find, throughout the organization. I want to share with you a curious example I encountered in Buenos Aires when I was working there, because the language services department came to us and asked us, do you know which athletes are competing where? And we said, okay, yes, of course we do. So why were they asking this question? Basically, they wanted to know how many interpreters or translators and for which languages they needed to engage and place in each venue. Because, you don't need to be a genius to find out that you will not place a Korean translator in the cycling venue if there is no Korean athlete qualified for cycling, right? So I think you'll start to getting the idea of this planning tool. So I will challenge you this time, and the last example I will leave you to answer. So why do you think that protocol services or even ceremonies can benefit from this file? Or why do you think they need to have numbers way in advance about team sizes and for their planning? So I challenge you to reply in the comment box, and we will solve it at the end of the presentation.
So numbers are not only what sport entries is all about. It is a big part, that is undeniable. But a very important part is the unique position and role that sport entries have in games, which is heavily influenced by the stakeholders. There are 3 main stakeholders for sport entries to be successful, which involves a lot of relationship building between sport entries and, number 1, the event or games owner, for example, the International Olympic Committee, who is the owner of the Olympic Games and the Youth Olympic Games. Number 2, the sport federations, which are like FIFA, European Swimming Association, which are the owners and the entity responsible for the sports that are being participated in the games. And number 3, the national committees or associations, for example, the National Olympic Committee of Malaysia, Argentina, the Commonwealth Games of Canada, University Sports South Africa. Those national entities are also the third stakeholder that is important in the success of sport entries. Sport entries, as you can see, is placed in the middle of these 3 main stakeholders, which means that we need to talk with every one of them. So the first one that we normally start to talk with is the event owner, which is like the IOC, because they are the owners of the events and because they are the ones to approve our policies and procedures, and actually we are the ones who implement what they want. So they are ultimately the one who also makes the exceptions. Number 2, we talk to the international federations because they provide us with the sport format and regulations and decide which athlete is eligible or not. They are also the developers of the qualification system documents, which Andres will explain in a short while. Then we also talk to national Olympic committees because they are the ones that registers the athletes to the games. Yep, you heard me right. It is them that registers the athletes. So I'm going to share with you a short story. When people ask me, what exactly do you do in sport entries? Do you fill up a form with the athletes' names and submit it into the system? No, that is not what we do. Basically, we let other people do the job for us. No, I'm joking. But it is actually the National Olympic Committees or the National University Sports Federation who actually enter athletes into the games because they are the ones responsible for the athletes to participate. for that particular major sport event. So in between them, of course, they do talk to each other as well, because the event owner needs the federations to run the sport, and the event owner needs the national committees to provide athletes for the sport, or else what's the whole point of an event, you know? Then the National Olympic Committees talk to their respective national sport federation, because ultimately each athlete is the responsibility of the national sport federation. So it is the National Sport Federation that collects and provides the athletes' information to the National Olympic Committee, which then provides it to us. Each national sport federation is a member of their respective international federation. So for example, for World Championships, the national sport federations are the ones to make the registration to the event. National Olympic committees are not associated to the international federations, and therefore they only communicate with them when it comes to the quota allocations and confirmations, which also Andres will mention a little bit later, sorry. But national Olympic committees and international federations do communicate with each other in 2 years or 4 years, depending on the winter or the summer Olympic Games, or even any other major sport event that happens. So you can see here that even though sport entries is very located in the middle of everything, we only talk to IOC or the event owner, we talk to the IF, and also we talk to the National Olympic Committees. We do not talk to the athletes directly or the national federations.
So let's jump into the timeline that impacts sport entries. So here we have an example of a multi-sports event with a qualification period or a qualification process. So the first step would be the development and the publishing of the qualification systems. So this is not done by sport entries per se, but it's a job or it's a responsibility of each international federation to develop this, as they are the experts of their sports. And sport entries is just responsible for implementing these qualification systems. And these will also be the fundamentals and the roots for our big tracking file that you see before, or in general, the tracking and monitorings we do. Starting from the publishing of the qualification system, the qualification period starts. So all the athletes will try to qualify, and all the delegations will try to qualify as many athletes as possible. But also, it's the point where our tracking and monitoring starts. Actually, it might start a bit earlier, as Neo mentioned, and we would use historical data from previous games to make a first draft and an estimate of the sizes, because more or less where there is a tradition for a sport, usually the tradition is kept and the best athletes will come from certain areas. And periodically, the more qualification events happen, the clearer we'll get our estimation file, and the clearer we'll get our picture to share with all the functional areas, as we said before. Another big step for us is to set up the system. So setting up the sport entry system, we would do ideally with the system provider, and also maybe with accreditation, to sum up all the requirements and data fields that we would need. And also a big portion here is the testing phase. So we would do a lot of testing, because of course we want to make sure before the final or the end user receives the link that all the functionalities are working. The next step is then the registration phase. I mean, this belongs more to accreditation, not to sport entries. So accreditation would ask the delegations to register all the potential athletes that they think that might qualify. Even if they have a remote chance, we would like to receive this information, because with this data, there are still a lot of processes that we need to pass before the athletes actually can come to the games. So the earlier we have this data, the better for us. And this is the point for my next step, which is the task of sport entries, which is the data verification. I mean, here it's, we verify the athletes' data that was provided by the delegations. So for this, usually we would cooperate in some way with the International Federation, who would share with us their database. So we have a manner to compare their database with what the delegations inputted into the system. And from there, we would see discrepancies if the passport name are wrong in the IF database or in our database. I mean, this is the sort of issues we would try to solve them. Also the preferred names, or even the date of birth, sorry, because in some sports there is an age limit, for example, in Youth Olympic Games, so it becomes very relevant and important that the ages or the dates of birth are correct to ensure that they are eligible to participate in that event, of course. Another point that we verify is if the passports for an athlete correspond to the delegation they are going to represent. And sometimes even we try to solve conflicts when one athlete is registered by two different delegations, which also happens sometimes. I'm going to my next point, and the next step. We will ask all the delegations to input sport-specific data related to the athletes. So this is not accreditation data, is more like, as the name says, sport-specific. So this would be like the ranking of an athlete in tennis, or if he's left or right-handed. For example, for a handball team, we would ask the delegation to provide which is the colors of the first uniform, which are the colors of the second uniform, or the goalkeeper's uniform, and even the numbers at the back of the t-shirts or the names at the back of the t-shirt. I will explain you why this information is relevant in a short while. Because before, I want to go to our next step, which is the most important step, which is the sport entries deadline. So this is the time where the delegations make their short list, we call it. So short list means they basically select the final list of athletes that are going to represent the delegation at the respective games. Basically, also, we call it entries by name because basically from the quotas they earned during qualification, they are putting the name to each quota. So that's why we also call it sometimes entries by name. And these names of athletes per event and the collected sport-specific data is then sent to the timing and scoring systems on each venue. And this happens during the initial download. So why do they need this information? So this information, of course, is needed that people in the stadium then can see in the displays, like the names of the athletes participating, of course, or for example, in TV graphics, when they put the starting squad, you could see nicely also the uniform colors and the numbers of each player. So see, we are playing a quite important role there. And well, before starting in sport entries, I always ask myself, so what happens actually between the sport entries deadline and the start of the game if an athlete gets injured? So I learned when I started that there is actually a late athlete replacement policy or a withdrawal policy in place, which basically, I mean, depends from games to games, but in general terms is the delegation needs to send us a medical document proving that the athlete is injured, and then the IF would approve this or not, and then the NOC or the delegation would be entitled to replace this athlete in case the sport qualification system allows it, or in some other cases, it will be just called a withdrawal, and another National Olympic Committee and another athlete from another delegation will benefit from this situation and will suddenly be part of the game. So, sorry, good point. I almost forgot one important task that also has sport entries, and we do it also with the help in cooperation with the International Federation, is to check the eligibility of the athletes. Because of course, the delegations cannot just send any athletes to the games. Sometimes the qualification system will require a minimum criteria. So for example, in judo, you will need to have a black belt. I mean, very simply said. I mean, sometimes it's a qualification time, sometimes it's a qualification score. So with the help of the International Federation, who would provide us this data, we verify before confirming the final list that all athletes are eligible to participate in the games. One big document that we work with a lot in sport entries, and who has worked in sport entries will know that, is the qualification system. This document is usually, as I mentioned before, developed by the International Federation, and that is governing that particular sport and discipline. But the event owner, and in my example, I will use IOC, would set up a few principles that each qualification system must contain. So the first principle is performance. So of course, you would like to have the best athletes in the Olympic Games or in any games. So the qualification system must ensure that there is a clear and transparent qualification process in place, and not by appointing somebody, for example, or some teams. And the path is clear, saying that you can qualify through a world championship or a specific qualification event, or through a ranking of a sport. But the games would not be the games, for example, if the best athletes come all from the same country, no? Then it would be like more a national championship than like a, I don't know, multicultural festival. So the universality principle tries to cut this, and through the implementation of a maximum quota of athletes per delegation per sport, they try to increase the universality within the sport. What they also want to achieve is to guarantee that there is a good continental representation in each event. So, for example, you can do it with a continental qualification event in each continent. You will guarantee that in that sport, every continent is represented. Another point is for smaller nations that have difficulties to qualify athletes, like some islands, I don't know, they have not the means to compete at the international level so often. The universality principle tries to keep some spots free as a terms of wild cards, you can call it, or universality places, which would be given to these smaller nations having difficulties to qualify, so that at the global level, the most possible delegations can participate at the games. The third principle is the host country representation, which is basically each qualification system should allow the host country one spot normally. This is also, well, to guarantee and then to motivate the local crowd to cheer for somebody at each venue, no? And one principle that is getting more prominent and more important is gender equality. So the qualification system should, in principle, ensure that there is the same amount of athletes, of male athletes and female athletes, no? And I say in principle because for some disciplines, like the Greco-Roman wrestling, for example, is just a discipline for male athletes. On the other hand, the rhythmic gymnastic is just for female athletes. So what is trying to be achieved is that at the global level or the games level, the amount of quotas for men and female are simply the same. I will just go very briefly and very quickly over the elements of one qualification document. So first of all, the first element is, the quotas are defined. So basically the number of quotas available per sport are defined here. Also, the maximum quotas per delegation per athlete in that sport are also defined in that segment. Another thing is the type of quota, which I also didn't know before. So in sport entries, we have two types of quotas. I always thought that, and it makes sense, no? The athlete that qualifies gets the spot automatically, no? But no, sometimes yes, sometimes no, depends on the sport. So where the athlete qualifies himself, that we call a nominal quota. And sometimes the athlete would qualify the delegation, and the delegation then would or can choose whoever they want to bring to the games. I mean, within a certain minimum of requirements. No? That's why sometimes we have these national championships, for example, in swimming in the US, they are quite popular and big, where they define who get the 4 spots in swimming. So this type of quota would also be defined in the qualification system. Then we have the qualification pathway, which is probably the most important one. It basically describes how the quotas are distributed and given. Like, for example, 5 quotas go to the 5 best in the World Championship, then 2 of the best in each continental championship, or through a qualification event. Or let's say there is no qualification event, and the 40 best of the ATP ranking and WTA ranking are allowed or are qualified to the games. So these things are written in the pathway. And of course, there must be always a plan B, because there must be, what happens when a quota is not used and will not be used by somebody? Then we need to know who is the next in line to earn this quota. And this basically is described in the reallocation part of the qualification system. And finally, there's just the timeline, which just lines up the key dates of all the qualification events and the key dates of the registration and the sport entries deadline. So this is more or less all the elements of the qualification system. Now, very briefly as well, the timeline of an event without qualification. And basically, as you can see, it's quite similar. Just 2 elements are different. So first of all, and of course, there is no qualification system development or no qualification period, but there is this element called entries by numbers. So what does this mean? This means that the delegations at a certain point are asked by the organizing committee to provide the numbers of athletes they think will participate in each sport or discipline. So basically, this will make their METS file or their tracking and estimations. The NOCs and delegations are encouraged to be accurate here, because if everybody is indicating 10 or 20% more than they will bring, it makes a huge impact in budget and in planning numbers. So sometimes there is also a financial commitment or a financial, element here, where they will ask the delegations to pay for the athletes they are registering to keep them like in a realistic, level. And as well, some events require a starting money per athlete. And then in the sport entries deadline and phase is the same as in the example before, is when they will give these quotas or these numbers that they indicated a name, basically.
So to sum up what we have presented so far, there are several key building blocks to the success of sport entries. The first is the team or people. Well, in multi-sport events, depending on the size of the event, the sport entries team can vary from just having 1 person to 16 people, like in Tokyo 2020. And the responsibilities are normally split up according to groups of delegations, where language proficiency plays quite a big part. So one coordinator will be in charge of a group of delegations and also a group of sports, where the coordinator is responsible for the communication and management of the qualification system and quotas with the respective international federations. Therefore, the people that make this team have to be composed of people who possess different language skills and a knack for logic, numbers, and maybe database. Plus, of course, they have to be team players.
One of the most prominent blocks and elements is the communication and relationship, skills or part. As you might remember, this slide that Neo presented with a lot of arrows. Yes, so at the end of the day, we speak with a lot of people. Main stakeholders of ours is, international federations and national Olympic committees, in an Olympic environment, but delegations in general. And sometimes we even act as intermediaries between international federation and national Olympic committees. So at the end, almost 50% of our time is spent in communication. But we should not only focus on external stakeholders, but also on our internal functional areas, we need to build up a strong relationship. First of all, with the functional areas that we provide numbers to, like the arrivals and departures we spoke before, and village allotment, but also with the functional areas like accreditation and of course, delegation services, which are the owners of the athletes that we deal with. And anything would be possible or so easy nowadays if we don't have a reliable system with us. So the system should be, like flexible, reliable, and should adapt easily to our business processes. So that's, well, one of the big keys that are needed to have a successful sport entry.
Now, on top of the three elements that we mentioned previously, this one element deserves a special slide on its own. And I know, Laura, you are watching with me and you would agree. It is important to note that sport entries is a vital part of the delegation registration process, which was mentioned by Laura in the episode of What is Delegation Services, where she was talking together with Paula Mora. The close collaboration and relationship between sport entries, accreditation, and delegation services is what ultimately gets delegations to the games. We cannot work in silos. We have to remember that delegation services is the client's owner, which means they need to be informed and involved in everything that happens with the athletes and delegates. Accreditation, on the other hand, is the start and the end of the registration process. Delegations start the registration process by entering the data into the accreditation system, and that's where sport entries finally get the data to check. And accreditation is the end of the process, where confirmed athletes and delegates get their accreditation cards. So you can see that the relationship and glossiness of this beautiful golden triangle that is composed of delegation services, sport entries, and accreditation is very, very important. So as in every aspect of events, there are always opportunities for improvements, especially when one has experienced what not to do or could have done better. It is not about reinventing the wheel, but it is actually to make it roll faster. And we can do that by sharing knowledge like what we are doing today in order to provoke ideas and discussion. So there are 4 main improvement points that both Andres and I would like to share, and at the same time provoke and challenge you to think of the future of sport entries. The first one is the combination of the accreditation and sport entries functional area. Combining the accreditation and SCQ, which we always have that in short for sport entries and qualification functional areas, a delegation is treated as a whole unit and not separately as it traditionally was when sport entries was focusing on athletes and accreditation was focusing on the other delegates. Let me ask you this question also. What does a sport entries coordinator do when the games begin? As you saw in the timeline, the heavy operations for sport entries finish before the games. Now, with the fusion of the accreditation and SCQ functions, we can reduce one local organizing committee contact person for the National Olympic Committee to liaise with. And this provides the accreditation and SCQ coordinator a complete overview of the registration data of the delegation. So it is an end-to-end process. The second part of the improvement is the removal of a phase just for sport entries. We used to have sport entries phase because it was tied to the way the system was designed, separately from accreditation. Nowadays, with the advancement of technology, do we really need that special phase where we say, okay, NOCs, it's time for you to enter the system and enter your sport-specific data? Can't we collect the data right from the start of the registration phase if we already know what to collect? And if there are more data that needs to be collected, then let's just add it on because the registration process is still open.
One of the big other improvements, I believe, is a necessity soon, is to centralize and standardize the quota allocation and confirmation. So just to give you a bit of a background, Normally, when the international federations or after a qualification event, they would allocate the quotas to specific delegation, and then they would expect the delegation to send them a confirmation if they accept or reject the quota. In the past, or since nobody has looked at this from a centralized point of view, every IF at the end allocated their quotas, in their own style. Some send just an email, some send an attachment with a form that needs to be filled out, or some send their quota allocation with just a publication online, and they expect the NOCs to confirm somehow the quotas. So you can see that there are a lot of different ways, like depending how the IF works normally, to allocate these quotas. So while we could not centralize everything in one system, everybody uses the same system to allocate the quotas from one hand, and from the other hand, the delegations to confirm or reject the quotas. And then also the organizing committee will have the full overview which quotas have been rejected and confirmed. And the last improvement, I think it's a necessity in the very near future, since it's a very, hot topic nowadays. It's the linking of the IF database or the IF system directly with the local organizing committee system. Ideally through what, developers call like an API. For the tech geeks, you would know what that means. But basically, it's like a way to connect two systems. Why I say this is a necessity in the near future is because, as I mentioned before, we rely a lot on the information that IS provide us in terms to do data discrepancy checks, but also to confirm eligibilities, or sometimes the sport-specific data is provided through the IF. So what I have experienced in the past is that these massive Excel files with a lot of personal information are just shared via email in an Excel file unprotected, which raises many doubts about data protection laws. So I think we need to create a safe environment to transfer this data from bubble to bubble in a safe way. And that's why I believe it's one of the key points that are needed in the near future.
So we have reached the last slide. And before I go to this beautiful quote on the screen, I think all of you have gotten the idea of sport entries, which I mentioned in the beginning, which is essential for proper planning and the actual athletes. So looking into the now of sport entries, what we say in this age of technology is that we should not allow a system to define the business processes, not only in sport entries, but in all aspects of an event. There is no reason whatsoever why a system in the year of 2020 that cannot be adapted to the business processes. It is also not accepted that learnings from previous experiences are not used to improve a system. Therefore, a system for an event, as Andres had said earlier, must be flexible, versatile, and one that empowers its users in order for users to be able to implement their business processes according to what is most efficient in time and manpower, which eventually leads to a reduction in the organization's overall cost. With that in mind, IGNITX is always looking for system companies that fit those criteria. And for sport entries, a team of experts in sport entries, including Andres and myself, are working to develop and enhance the WISTEAM event work system in terms of sport entries and the holistic view of the delegation registration process. Thank you, and back to you, Ursula.
That's very interesting, the presentation. We have some questions from the public. Shall we start with the questions from the public?
Yes.
So Laura has just asked, there was a question in the presentation, in her presentation, if DRM's process can be implemented in the Olympics.
Shall I take that, Andres?
Sure.
Okay. Hola, darling. So I remember this question, and I was also going to answer it during this time. Well, I think the digital DRMs where we refer to as delegation registration process is it's very relevant for the Olympic Games. I mean, we are already doing it for the Youth Olympic Games because of the qualification system, which ends earlier than the finalization of the delegation. But it doesn't mean that when we implement the digital delegation registration process for the Olympics or any other games for that matter, that we need to depend on the qualification system finishing earlier. What we can do, I do believe, is that we can do up to 80% of the process, and then at the host country city, you can still have the delegation registration meeting, which is normal to be had, and finalize the team there. I mean, right now, the process in the Olympics is that you are the delegation, I'm the sport entries manager or accreditation, and basically in accreditation, we do it by paper form. So you have your report, I have my report, and we just go line by line doing this. Why not do this in advance before coming to the host city? So this is already, if we put it into the digital part, it's already an improvement, and it will cut down the number of hours that needs to be spent for the delegation registration meeting itself. But to answer your question, of course, looking into the future, if qualification systems can end before the sport entries deadline, which is before the opening of the village, then of course it is definitely possible to do the delegation registration process or the digital delegation registration process all in advance before the delegation arrives to the host country. So it is a ripple effect. The qualification system, the opening of the village, the delegation registration meeting, everything is a ripple effect. So I think event owners like the IOC or the CGF or FISU, when you think about timeline, make sure that you actually have all these important functional areas come together and think about the dates and the timeline before making just one decision on a silo effect that then affects all the other functional areas decision making.
I have one question, Leo, I think it's for you. It said something about accreditation being together with spot entries, but we know that accreditation is not just registering people; it's also other things, other operational things such as printing the cards and everything. Do you think that accreditation should be together with spot entries for everything?
So, since I said quite a lot from the past question, I'm going to pass it to Andres first to see what he says. Because Andres was the accreditation and sport entries manager for Lausanne. So how did it work for you, Lausanne?
I mean, in Lausanne, we basically split both departments. First of all, we combined somehow sport entries and accreditation, but we, I don't know, within the team, we split the responsibilities. So myself and my Sebastian, my other co-worker, we were focusing mainly on accreditation operations and registering the clients that are more local, like the contractors, volunteers, which make a big part as well of all the registrations for accreditation. So we were focusing more, on operations and registering local clients, while the other half of the team, Victoria and Leah, they would focus more on the whole registration for the delegations and the international federations. But in terms of delegations, it's true that they would have the better overview for the delegation from start to the end, because they also were doing sport entries for them. So it's what you said, they combined two roles in one, what we mentioned as an improvement.
And I would like to add on to that, because in Buenos Aires and also actually going back one Youth Olympic Games before in Lillehammer 2016, we already started to combine accreditation and sport entries. And actually, Ursula, you have a very valid point. it can actually depend on how that organizational structure is done. I mean, right now, why do we need to follow the traditional structure? We can think of other structures. We can put operations of accreditation maybe under operations, and then the registration of the delegation under delegation services. Sport entries can sit under delegation services. Sport entries normally sits under sports. But in Buenos Aires, and my director is here, and Martin, thank you for watching me and asking me to smile. He was very confident that accreditation and sport entries could work, and for that, we actually did a good job in Buenos Aires, and we showed actually the people who are doing major sport events that accreditation and sport entries can be combined.
And also to jump in that, when sport entries is usually under sport, normally at the end of the day, we didn't deal much with sports per se, which is a bit weird sometimes if you think about it.
Yes, correct. Sport, our relationship with the international federations and also with sports in our functional area was very different than other colleagues in sport, like you, Ursula. You were doing sports scheduling, which you also were sitting under the sports department.
Yes, yes. We have one other question from the public. Luciana is asking, we know that there is a difference between NOCs, National Olympic Committees. So by having combining everything together, how do we having a system that will have the process everything at once? How do we cope with the human factor?
I guess you are referring, Luciana, to the.
I think it was regarding to have everything online, a system that will enter all the information from the athletes online.
I mean, I think I can take it, or to start with. As I understand the question, of course, and I can relate for sure, as in Buenos Aires, I was managing some African NOCs. I mean, this human factor will always exist, and this, I don't know. I mean, of course, for some users, we will not expect to do everything online. In an ideal world, yes. So we would try to teach them how to use the system to be proficient in the next games to use the same systems, of course, if the processes keep being the same. But I think, I mean, and that's the beauty still of sport entries, that you still keep in touch with your delegations and NOC, and you build up this relationship to see where you can help best the delegation you are communicating with. And for somebody that is autonomous and wants to do his own thing, I mean, it's better for us that he does his thing. It's better for him, better for us, less time that we waste in between. So, and that's sadly on one way where the world is going. Like, nobody has much time anymore to chat. It's like only perform, and well, but at least embrace that, and that's how you keep resources low.
And I also would like to add to that, Luciana. I mean, if I am talking and like what Andres said about the smaller and less, basically smaller NOCs with less financial support, we have to start them somewhere. So why not start them now, rather than always thinking that, oh, they are the black sheep of the family. So we always have to make our policies and procedures fit them. But if you look at the percentage of them, I mean, of these small NOCs, it is actually a very small portion of the pie, So actually, we need to embrace the fact that we need to support them and we need to start them somewhere. And why not start them now? And not continue to say, oh, they cannot do it. So we need to adapt to them. No, they have to try to adapt. But when we say we have to help, they have to adapt to us, then we have to provide them with the tools and the support that they need.
That's very good. I have one other question. I think it's for Andres, but for both of you. We know that Eddie the Eagle or Jamaica Sub-Zero are very inspiring stories. and they all come from a universality place, which is not very known for the general public. But sometimes there are questions on why the performance of the athlete is not that is not together with the rest of the group. So can you comment on that?
It's a good question, very difficult to answer, but I mean, I see the point that there are questionings about performances, no? Because we say that we want the best athletes to be at the games, of course, and then we have, for example, I remember in Sydney, a swimmer that needed like, I don't know, 5 minutes more than the other swimmers. But at the end of the day, these are the stories that make the Olympic Games great. I think that are the stories that inspire the people, like to not give up, to be, I don't know, to strive for this sporting excellence, and also I think all the others were respecting these athletes that made it to the games. And on one hand, also the universality places are needed to guarantee that each nation is represented, for example, in the Summer Olympic Games or Summer Youth Olympic Games, because, well, the message of sport, or as I interpret it, is to create a better world through sport. And what's the best language to use than, I don't know, uniting everybody and, I don't know, having all the nations in one place.
Agreed. We're coming to 1 hour, so should we close this? Thank you very much to everyone who joined us.
I have one thing more.
Sure.
I mean, I'm very sad that nobody replied to my question about protocol. I should have offered a beer or something. But basically, to reply to that question, so why the METS is important for protocol services or ceremonies is for ordering flags. Because procuring flags is also very expensive. You probably never thought about that, but it is. So if there is only one athlete from one country in skiing, for example, from, I don't know, from the Virgin Islands, you would not buy the same amount of flags as for USA or Austria in winter, you know. So that's more or less the answer.
So
on this point, I want to challenge it going into the future. Why not we have digital flags?
So that's for our next What Is Series.
For sure. So thank you everyone who joined us. Next week on Friday, we're gonna have two good friends of mine, Paul Andrade and Irina Panushkina. It's gonna be Friday, August 21st at 11:30 Swiss time. What is a village allotment? So join us to see that episode. That will be fantastic. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Ciao.